Hi everybody, my name's Hannah and I'm going to be talking to you today about Roman signal stations. This is intended to be a Key Stage 2 resource, but hopefully everybody can enjoy. Before we can explore the archaeology of Roman Britain, we need to first understand what Britain looked like almost 2,000 years ago. At this time, Britain was inhabited by groups of people now commonly referred to by many as the Celts, who had split the rule of Britain into large groups or tribes. Known for their pagan religious practices, worshipping multiple gods and goddesses such as Epona, the horse goddess, the Celts were unique groups of people living in farmsteads or defensive settlements known as hill forts across Britain, and later in smaller villages which were then adopted and developed in many cases by the Romans. Celtic society was, in many ways, a developed society much like our own, with craftspeople producing fine gold pieces like neck rings to indicate wealth and the use of basic coinage in some areas. So, who were the Romans and why did they invade Britain? When you think of the Romans, what do you think of? Perhaps you think of the army? Or gladiators? Even coinage? Emperors and huge marble statues? Pottery? Or even beautiful mosaic floors like this one? But do we ever think about the coast? In this short video, we're going to discover why the coast of Britain was so important in the Roman period, and how they defended it. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar, perhaps the most well-known of all Romans, having already conquered nearby Gaul, or modern-day France, ventured to Britain with a small group of soldiers. Historians are still not sure the exact reason for his ventures, but it was possibly to help boost his position or gain prestige, or to gather more information about the British people, and possibly even to gather resources and valuable goods like silver. But Caesar's adventures were seen largely as a failure by the Roman people, as he gained very little after meeting resistance from many of the Britons. This isn't to say that all Britons were anti-Roman. In fact, a few leaders actually maintained contact with the Romans and their way of life, trading goods and adopting certain Roman practices and ideas, helped by Britain being so close to Gaul, which was already conquered by the Romans, and therefore being able to share goods and ideas. It took almost another 100 years before the Romans ventured to Britain again, but this time they were successful, with the invasion of Britain beginning in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius. Starting in the south of Britain, the Romans advanced slowly north, establishing strongholds in a range of areas. For the next 400 years, the Romans ruled over Britain, establishing settlements across the country, like this one at Aldborough in North Yorkshire, and introducing the British people to their customs, combining their religions and practices, and Roman soldiers even making new families with British people. So we've painted a picture of Roman Britain that is quite peaceful. However, the Romans still had to deal with rebellious groups and needed to establish forts and fortresses across Britain to defend themselves and establish order. Many of these defensive structures do not survive in the landscape today. However, there are a few which do. You may have heard of Hadrian's Wall, or big forts in the north of Britain such as Vindolanda, Housesteads and Bosworth, three of the most famous sites in the UK. These defensive structures and forts were established to act as a base for different groups of the Roman army to control different areas of Britain, but also to provide a level of protection for the now Roman British settlements from marauders or rebellious groups, as there were still many who weren't happy with the Roman occupation of Britain. So we've talked about forts and fortresses which were built inland across the country. But do you think this is the full story? What about the coast? Although people often think of the Romans as a land-based civilization, the sea actually played a huge role in the expansion of empire. In fact, if we look at the map, we can see how most of the spread of the Roman Empire started with coastal areas before spreading inland. We mentioned earlier that there was some trade happening between other parts of the Roman Empire and Britain. As you may know, trade is the exchange of objects like food, drink, and valuable goods like metals between countries or groups of people. In archaeological digs, we sometimes find things like pottery with traces of olive oil or wine. Now, at this time, Britain didn't grow grapes or olives, so how did they get there? Through trade with other countries. But Britain's an island, so how did they get the goods in? Well, they came in from the sea. Brought in on boats, the sea was hugely important to spreading the Roman way of life across the empire, including to Britain. But with the coast being so important, it also needed to be defended. Not everyone coming across to Britain was there to trade goods. So, how did the Romans do this? Well, they built what was called signal stations around the coastline in key areas which were important. But what did they look like? Well, here is an idea of how they may have looked. Roman signal stations were large towers, shown in red, which were then surrounded by a large ditch, shown here in blue, which is thought to have enclosed a walled courtyard area, shown in yellow, with a gatehouse to control who came in and out. There were 3 different types of signal station that we know of that were built during the occupation of Britain, all dating from different periods and built in different styles. Initially, they were thought to be built in timber and then replaced by stone. These signal stations were built at various points on the coast so that the army could see what was going on out to sea and let nearby forts or towns know if there was a problem by using fire and smoke signals, and even pass messages across longer distances using a number of signal stations as a chain. How? Well, on the top of each square or rectangular tower there would be what we would call a beacon, which is essentially a fire, which could be used to send signals to those who knew what the smoke or fire meant. So essentially, they acted as an early warning system in the days where there were no mobile phones. But being a soldier stationed in one of these signal stations would have been brutal. Imagine the conditions up there on a cold winter's day, no proper heating, and the stormy weather crashing in. Not nice at all. So, is it just a really old lighthouse? Well, sort of. Lighthouses are a safety measure which help sailors out to sea to judge how far away from the coast edge they are, so that they don't get into trouble with any rocks. Like lighthouses, signal stations also acted as a beacon in the landscape, but they were used to pass messages rather than to keep sailors away. So, similar structures, but both doing a different job. So, why don't we know more about these signal stations, and are there any left today? The only known surviving remains of signal stations here in Britain are from the later period, around the 4th century AD. Unfortunately, most of the standing remains of these are long gone. However, one place where you can still see the remains of a signal station is at Scarborough in North Yorkshire. Scarborough is perhaps the best preserved signal station here in Britain, with much of the earthwork remains of the signal station still visible in the landscape. Here we can see the clear outline of the entry point, where a gatehouse may have stood, with the ditched enclosure surrounding the boundary wall, which enclosed the courtyard and main tower. Scarborough was one of a series of signal stations on this stretch of coast, which were all linked. So what happened to the others? Sadly, the remains at Huntcliffe, Ravenscar, Filey and potentially Whitby have all been lost. However, there are still physical clues about their locations which survive in the landscape today.
Here at Filey, all that remains of the signal station is this small dip behind me, and this is the original site of the Roman signal station ditch. Unfortunately, there are no standing remains left on the Roman signal station, and this is all that remains to show us where it once stood. However, if we turn around to Scarborough in the background, we can just about see there the line of sight that you would have had, a very, very clear line between the two signal stations, here at Filey and over at Scarborough.
With increased storms and rising sea levels, climate change is having a huge impact both on our coast and the archaeology it contains. Around the UK, we're losing in some areas around 4 metres of coastline every year, with erosion in some areas sped up by climate change. Whilst 4 metres doesn't seem that much, if we think that every year we're essentially losing around a car's length of coast in some places, that's actually quite a lot. This doesn't mean it happens everywhere though. In fact, in other areas of Britain, the coastline actually does the opposite and is getting larger due to shifting sands being moved around the coast and dumped in other areas. So, what have we learned in this video? Well, firstly, we've learned a little bit about the invasion of Britain by the Romans and the defensive systems that they put in place across the country. We've learned why the sea and the coastline of Britain was so important to the Romans, both for trade and to defend the island. We've learned what a Roman signal station was for, what they might have looked like, and finally, we've touched on the effects of climate change, and specifically coastal change, on archaeology. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to find out a little more about coastal erosion, do check out Danny's videos about coastal erosion and have a go at making your own class science experiment.